Hello, good evening and welcome. I'm Karima Brown and you're watching Political Exchange, where we unpack Africa's political economy. As global trade patterns shift amid the ongoing Euro crisis, the Global South has had to refocus relations, particularly among emergent markets, and with potentially huge implications for business on the African continent. Joining us now to look at this issue more broadly, I'm joined by Dr. Francois Ikoko, who is Regional Chief Africa for the UNDP South-South Cooperation. Dr. Ikoko, thank you so much for joining us. As we said in the introduction, things are changing in the world. We've seen huge changes in the way in which trade patterns are working, with your traditional developed countries going through, severe crises. How are South-South relations beginning to shape up against this global, environment?
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, it has been remarkable that the Global South at this point in time is doing so well economically, or has been doing so well economically. The move being driven by China, India, Brazil, and African economies have benefited from these changes. And it happened that while Europe was in crisis, those emerging economies were coming up and helped African countries to handle their economies pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we have noticed that growth has slowed down even in these economies that appear to have surged, tremendously. Let's look at China. These, economists are quite divided on where we are with China. Obviously, there has been a slowdown, but people are still confident that demand is so high in China, and with a growing middle class, that even though there is a slowdown, projections are, that it will pick up again. What are the potential implications for particularly countries on the African continent who are so tied to China, given the fact that it's not that clear that the growth is going to continue climbing and that it's sustainable necessarily?
What we should admit is that African countries, in as much as they are trading, they continue to trade with China, they also trade with the North, let's call it the North, meaning Western Europe and the United States. And I think what is important is that African countries manage to use both partners when one is slowing down, take advantage of opportunities in others, but at the same time try to trade within the continent, because there is also a potential there. So Africa should take advantage of the opportunities in the Global South, the opportunity in the North, and the opportunities within the continent.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's interesting that you say this, because I've just been interviewing the EU ambassador to South Africa off the back of the summit that was held in Brussels recently. And they pretty much saying the same thing. They're talking about diversifying and not, putting all your eggs in one basket. If one looks at particularly, and I want to return to China, we'll come to the other emerging markets, but let's look at the Africa-China relationship. We know the cooperation forum that has been created, that South Africa is now chairing, has of course made a meal of the fact that China is fast becoming the main trading partner of many African countries, and that we need to strengthen relations. But we know that many African countries are trying to recalibrate that relationship, and it cannot be a question of China just coming and extracting raw materials, and we're not exporting manufactured goods. How successful are we in getting the Chinese to understand that we need to have a more equal relationship?
Well, I would surprise you by telling you that the problem is not China. The problem is Africans. About 6 months ago, we had a conversation with the ambassador of China here. And basically he was saying, you put your condition on the table, we will examine them as partners, we'll look at it. And this is very much in line with the spirit and the principle of South-South cooperation. And I think what we fail to understand or to put on the table is the real principle of South-South cooperation. Because if all partners play by these principles, then we will not be seeing this kind of behavior or attitudes. So I think Africans have to have their act together. We have, for instance, noticed that while African countries are engaging external partners, they don't necessarily have policy framework on South-South cooperation. How can you go and discuss with partners without having your act together, without having your house in order? At the same time, those partners, emerging partners, they are very well organized. They have policy in place, they have strategies in place, and they have put resources aside to carry out or to implement their policies. So the problem in terms of South-South cooperation at this point is that Africa is not, unfortunately, ready. Africa needs South-South cooperation, but Africa is not yet ready to take advantage of the opportunities that are there.
Now, we know, of course, when the World Economic Forum Summit met, former UN General Secretary Kofi Annan spoke about this policy inconsistency and that it's a massive impediment in terms of, getting growth really ramped up on the continent. So, in a way, endorsing, some of the concern that you share. Why do you think it is that African countries are not getting the act together? Is it because we are still grappling with, what it means to be fully functional democratic states, given the fact that we've had a period of, intense change on the continent where we've moved from very closed authoritarian societies to more open societies? Is it because our political class is not familiar with policy development? What seems to be the problem?
Well, I think you have a number of elements. I would not say that there is just one. One is, when you look at it, the ruling elite is not necessarily organized. The second element that we've observed is that the vision of South-South cooperation, of what we want, what African countries want to do, is not always clear. The third thing, the third element is that African ruling elite tend to listen too much to their external partners. When you look at, again, if we take the case of China, it is known that China used its own understanding of the world, how things should be done. In the process, they made mistakes, but they corrected themselves. When you look at the African continent, you will realize that it has not always been the case. Advice from this one, advice from that one, another advice from another person. Confusion.
Is it because there is a lack of framing of an African, let's say, way of doing things? And is that even possible? Because the Chinese are known for approaching business in a particular way, like it or not. And as you say, they've made mistakes, but they are able to say, well, this is ultimately our vision, we can self-correct. Is the fact that we don't have that framework part of the reason why it appears as if our house cannot be in order?
Well, I would say there is an element of mindset. At times, well, I find myself in trouble with colleagues or friends when I say, when you look at history of countries that developed recently, you take the Tigers, you will realize that as they were focusing on their development, they put aside elements dealing with democracy. And this is empirical. You can check with almost all governments in tigers countries, those are considered as tigers, and see what type of regime they had at that time. But when you reach a certain level, then
there's an opening up.
There's an opening up. Actually, somehow one needs strong vision, strong leadership, a clear marching order to move forward. When you are, I would not say distracted, but when you hear so many sounds coming from left and right, you can lose your course.
Now, I want to pick up on this because it's very interesting what you were saying. We have seen several African economies liberalize, open up, enabling environments being created for investment. But this democracy deficit is something that does bother a lot of people. Not that it bothers business so much, because business doesn't always go where it's most democratic, because it might not be that profitable. But let's take a country like Angola that is oil rich, that is rich in mineral resources, but coming off a fairly closed society, certain real democratic deficits, if you like, and yet the investment is there. How would opening up Angola, making it a more transparent society, actually, fast track economic growth?
Well, I will not specifically focus on one country, but when I look at history, I realize that there is no automatic correlation between democracy and development. I cannot recall in the recent past a country that went so strongly or that went hand in hand managing its democratic transition and its economic development. However, we know now, at least in UNDP, that good governance is a key factor for economic development. And this good governance will include issues like transparency in managing resources. It will include things like combating corruption, having a set of known rules and regulations, rule of law. We know now that there is a correlation between those elements of governance and economic development. But we are not sure that democracy, as it is perceived, is a key ingredient to economic development. But the jury is out.
Dr. Ikoko, we will take a short break, but when we come back, we will continue our discussion with Dr. Francois Ikoko, talking about South-South relations and whether Africa has its house in order.